So crop planning for production efficiency. I just want to kind of go over these 4 bullets and talk about the relevance of using these spreadsheets and why we do some of this crop planning in the first place, and identifying your planning goals at the onset. Then we'll talk about getting started, creating the plan, and then actually using the plan. And then we're going to just dive right into the spreadsheet that I've been working on for a number of years, and I think it will be useful. It was initially developed as a spreadsheet that we would use on sort of a 5 to 10 acre diversified vegetable production farm, but this can easily be scaled back to used on any size operation, even down to a 100 square foot kitchen garden if you wanted to. So the big thing here, and the big reason why I wanted to talk about this in the context of the presentation on Saturday with the Sharing the Harvest Network, is this concept of food waste and production waste. So that second bullet, 20% of fruits and vegetables that most growers actually produce never even leave the field. So there's a tremendous amount of waste that small farmers on a variety of scales have within their operations, whether it's calling for seconds, which actually still could be used or processed or sold or eaten within a family farm context, or just stuff that just is bad and gets left in the field, or sometimes people produce way more than they actually need. Like, for instance, you might put in 150 tomato transplants when you really only needed 75. And you end up only selling the tomatoes from 75 transplants, and the rest of the poundage from the rest of that 75 transplants you don't have a market for, and it could go to waste. So having a plan in place at the beginning of a growing season is really helpful for you to be able to identify those goals so you don't reduce that waste. And then also, in terms of food waste in general, so Phil was asking about the first reason for the 20% fruit and vegetable waste. So that is an internal production factors on an individual farm, whether that's culling out seconds or produce that's not deemed worthy or the highest of quality to sell into a market, or planting and actually over producing or over planting in certain areas because you don't think either seed's going to germinate or sort of, you should always have a little bit of a smudge factor, like a 10% or 20% smudge factor for some things, but sometimes people plant way too much. So that 20% of fruits and vegetables that never leaves the field, that's where that factor comes in. That first bullet is just talking about that 30-40% of food is just wasted, period, in all contexts in the food system. So I think that is something really interesting and to keep in mind when we're thinking about planning on whether we're a large farm operation or even a very small operation, whether we're working with food pantries and donations, or just food production for our own family or small business. It's important to think about. So in terms of some goals that you should have with planning, I think these are some things that you should think about. So it's important to plan and try to forecast and grow only what you think you can sell. If you're a producer, eat if you're doing this just for home use, or donate in the context of the Share the Harvest group that I've been working with, in terms of produce that you can donate. Okay. And planning will kind of even out some work over the season and reduce harvest peaks and valleys. It can save time during the season, so you're not scrambling and trying to reorient a plan that you have in place. And you can anticipate needs during the season if you're doing planning at the beginning of the year, so everything's ready in advance. And then you can also maximize your space use and succession plantings. And we're going to talk a little bit about succession plantings and space use when we get into the spreadsheet. But I think there's a misconception. A lot of times people who put in gardens, there's this concept of putting your garden in the spring, where everyone kind of plants their garden one time around Memorial Day, and that's the only planting they do, and that can be great. You can get a lot of food over a long period of time that way. But what I'm talking about in terms of planning, even on the small scale, is thinking about how you can utilize that space for multiple plantings throughout an entire growing season. And if you're using season extension, so high tunnels, passively solar heated greenhouses, or you have some sort of ability to store like root crops, you can actually have a plan in place to where you could have produce available all year long, 12 months out of the year. So there's going to be a little bit of that in the spreadsheets as well, that we're kind of look at some of that. So when you're developing a plan for production, these are some things that you need to identify, just some basic things. So things like what to plant, how much to plant, where you're going to plant it, how to plant it, seed to purchase, and yield and gross. Okay, so those are all important factors to think about. And if you were to handwrite all this stuff out and just make little charts on notebook paper, this could take up a lot of time. So the reason why I'm a big advocate of spreadsheets is because if you build a spreadsheet, or you take a template like the one that I'm going to show you today or give to you, a lot of these formulas and calculations are already built in. So from year to year, if you're keeping records, diligent records about what you're producing, when you're planting, all of these things, these bullets that you see here, it's just real simple adjustments during the winter or off season that you can make to a plan that can save you tremendous amounts of time in planning. So when getting started, if you've already been keeping records and you have some records from previous years, it's good to collect that info before you sit down and start working with a spreadsheet like this. So if you have field notes from previous years, if you have any yield data from previous years, how big your plots are, all your seed catalogs that you need, any growing resources or extra charts, and then previous year spreadsheets and data. So the project that I worked on before I came on with Extension, those of you who were at the training on Saturday, you got a preview of that. But for Phil, I managed a 7-acre diversified year-round production farm down at the University of Illinois. And every single year from probably the beginning of December until the middle of January, so like 5 or 6 weeks, I was sitting down with previous year spreadsheets and all of this information here, and just diving into these spreadsheets and making the necessary adjustments for the plan for the year coming up. Okay, so that's just a little preview to give you an idea of where we're going. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull up, what I'll do is actually pull up an example from the Proviso Giving Garden. So this is a project that I've been working on up in the Maywood area, and Phil, who's on the call, is familiar with the site. It's essentially the reuse. It's on this business called the Reuse Depot, which actually demos and rehabs old houses, and they resell a lot of stuff at their main shop. But there's a group up in Maywood and Proviso Township working on food access that actually has this really cool gardening project on the west side of the building. And we built a 20 by 60 foot high tunnel on one side, and there's 18 raised beds inside of that tunnel. So this plan that we're going to look at is a plan based on a site that's 20 feet wide by 60 feet long, and it has 18 4 by 8 foot raised beds in the site. So just to kind of give you a little bit of context. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to present desktop again. I'm going to do my primary monitor like I did before. We're going to pull this up. People will be able to see. So everyone should be able to see the spreadsheet again. Can everyone see the spreadsheet? Maybe just say yes or type something into the text box so I know that you can see it again before I start talking about it. Okay, so Phil says yes. Okay, yes. So yes, so you can see it. I'm going to try to keep it at this level. I have it at about 50% zoom, and I'm just going to be scrolling over a bunch. So as you can see here on the bottom, there's a number of sheets within this spreadsheet. Okay, and I'm hoping, I know Phil definitely is, Mary and Susan, I hope that you're just at least a little bit familiar with Excel. Some of the equations that you're going to see here that are embedded within these cells are fairly complex, but I'm going to show you just some real simple ways that you could utilize a tool like this or pare it down to use on your site. So just really quickly on the bottom, you'll see there's a number of sheets. Starting with the left, it says instructions. It goes to master, succession master, so on and so forth. And I'm scrolling over now. Maybe you can't see me scrolling, but there's a bunch of different sheets on the bottom. Okay, so that's where they're all at, and we'll just kind of go over each one one by one to give you an idea. So at the beginning of this, I do have an instructions sheet here. Okay, and we'll kind of go over some of these cells. I'll let you, when I send you a link to this or a copy of this, you can go over this in a little more detail, but we'll just kind of go over some generalities right now. So the big thing that I want you to notice is the number one. So it says inputs are in blue boxes, edit these cells as you wish. And you'll kind of see as we move into the sheets why that is. But if you're really uncomfortable with Excel and you don't want to mess up any of the equations that are embedded in it, you could simply use this by changing the inputs that are in the blue boxes, okay? If you want to be very, very safe about it. Now, all the other cells do contain equations that range from really simple equations, so just real simple sum equations, or this cell plus this cell, or this cell minus this cell, to complex equations that have, if-then statements, or ceiling or floor statements. So if you're not super familiar with Excel, you may not want to mess with too much of the spreadsheet, but you should still be able to get a lot of good information out of it regardless. So just don't change the equations if you're not super familiar with how it's working. It probably took me, I've been working with this spreadsheet that I've adapted and morphed for probably about 6 or 7 growing seasons now. So I really understand the spreadsheet really well, and I've adapted it to my needs and my understanding. And I think if you work with it a little bit, you can adapt it to your needs and to make it work a little bit better for you. So that's the first thing to know. The second thing is customize the amount needed by calculating the following. Okay, so there's a number of different ways that this can be done, but in this spreadsheet what I've done is to start by entering the number of weeks you wish to harvest or distribute a crop under the number of weeks. Now the data that I have in this spreadsheet is data that I've collected over a number of growing seasons for a very intensive small scale farm. Now you may not want to distribute or harvest these crops for the same number of weeks, so you can easily edit the number of weeks. But I'm also going to give you a link to a bunch of spreadsheet templates that I use that are really easy ways of keeping track of when you're planting, when your first harvest was, when your last harvest was. So you can so as you move forward with using a planning template like this, you can adapt it to your needs. And then enter the amount you want to distribute or harvest each week under the amount per week. Okay, so this particular model is really kind of set up for and based off of a farm stand that we had at the student farm where as I collected records every single year, we had a certain amount of produce that we were selling every single week. So it would be like bok choy, the amount per week, and you'll see that'll be another column that you can edit. Number 3, edit spacing, bed size, and expected yield in a sheet called field spacing and yield. So, and in parentheses, I'm saying the current values that I have in this field spacing and yield sheet are based on what are called biologically intensive spacing. So these are it's mainly based off of a book by this grower named J.M. Fortier, but they're very similar to square foot garden spacings. If you've ever heard of John Jevons, there's a number of different intensive spacings that you can do. So this is probably just about as intense as you can get for some of these crops. And really quickly, I'm going to just scroll over it and show you guys that sheet so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. So on the bottom here, I'm just going to click over one. And you can see maybe 8 or 9 sheets over, there's a sheet that says field spacing and yield. Hopefully you guys can see that. I'll click on that. And so that should pull up a sheet that you can see in the A column. It says bed width, and you'll notice I actually have 2 different bed widths in that A column right there. Okay. And what this is, it's pretty straightforward. So if you look at the B column, it's a crop list of approximately, if you scroll down, about 71 different crops, but some of them are the same crop and there's successions built into it, and we're going to talk about that as we move forward. But that column B is essentially the crop list. And then as you move over to look at these subsequent columns, column C is what they call the in-row spacing. So that would be the spacing that you have in your row, between plants in the row. The between row spacing is the spacing between the plants if you have multiple rows. Column E is the number of rows per bed, the unit that for how we're going to be calculating our yield. Okay, so in this case, if you look at the first column, this would be arugula. Arugula early would be the arugula that would be planting in the spring. So we're thinking of that in terms of yield per row foot. So that would be pounds per row foot. And then column H says yield per bed foot. Okay, and then column is I is plants per bed foot, but you don't need to really get into that. But here you see we have some blue columns here. So these would be some adjustments that you can make that are based on your particular system. Now, for this particular spreadsheet for the Proviso Giving Garden, the beds that we're working with are 4 by 8 feet. Okay. Now, the reason why I have bed widths of 96 inches and 48 inches, which it represents 4 and 8 feet, is because some crops we actually plant in rows down the length of the bed, and some of them we plant down the width of the bed. Okay, that's just how I do it. So when you look at, for instance, rows per bed in column E, as you go, no, I'm sorry, that wouldn't be the right one. You look at, no, it should be that. Divided by C. Oh yeah, no, that is what it is. So when you look at rows per bed, it says floor. You don't need to. I'm not going to explain what that is, but essentially the equation reads. If you look up the equation bar, okay, so I'm kind of highlighting the equation bar right now. At the top, it says A5, which is 96 inches, divided by D2, which is the between row spacing, and it gives a floor because what that means is that it kind of rounds it to an even number. So in this case, I'm planting rows across the width of my 4 by 8 foot raised bed, and for arugula, in one full bed, I should be able to fit 16 rows, is what that means at that 1.25 inches in row spacing and 6 inch between row spacing. And then that yield per row foot, this is another parameter that you can change. And so, for instance, Phil, who's on the line, he's really interested. His project is focusing on cucumbers. So let's go all the way down and look at cucumbers. And in this case, Phil, what we're looking at here, what I have for my intensive biointensive system and my records is about 2 pounds of cucumbers per row foot planted. Okay, so there you go. So if you're going to use this just for cucumbers, you could you could delete everything else or zero everything else out and just use those columns right there and adjust that yield per row foot for cucumbers. So that's just kind of a rule of thumb. As you collect records for your project every single year, if you know that you have a 4 by 8 foot bed unit and you're keeping track of how many cucumbers you planted and the yield from that 4 by 8 foot bed, you're going to kind of have a rolling average of what you're pulling from that bed unit. So that number may change for you until you get a steady number. For us at the student farm, that's what this number was based on. In our biointensive yield, we are getting about 2 pounds per row foot. Okay, so if you're going to change that, that's where you would change that parameter. So I just wanted to point that out. So once you have all this locked in, all this data locked in, you don't really mess with this particular sheet anymore, unless your records over the years are indicating that your yield has changed for some reason. It's gotten better or it's gotten worse. That's where you might adjust that. Okay, so we're going to click back out of that and we're going to go back to the instructions really quick again. So we're on bullet 3. Edit spacing, bed size, expected yield. Again, I think I covered this. This particular example is based on a 4 by 8 foot raised bed unit. So in that column A that you see, you can change it. Let's just go back to that really quick. You could change it. So let's change A5, for instance. In an intensive in-ground system, where we're using long rows. So say like in my system at the student farm, we would use 30-inch wide beds, right? So I could type in 30, and as soon as I hit enter, you're going to see a bunch of things change. So you see how everything just changed right there? All the between row spacing changed, and the yield per bed foot and the plants per bed foot all changed. So just by simply adjusting your bed width in column A, you get all of those things to change. So I'm going to change it back to 90. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. We'll change it back to 96 and move on. So you can see how by changing that, it changes all of those different parameters. So Mary, you're asking a question for raised beds. You believe spacing is pretty good. Are you asking about this particular spreadsheet? Is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah, so for this I kind of mold over this. This is a hybrid between, and you know what, I'm just going to pull this up really quick before we move on, so you can kind of just visualize what I'm talking about. So right next to the field spacing and yield, I have this other tool sheet that I put out called the bed layout visualization tool. So this tool right here, this is kind of what I'm talking about. So we have the 4 feet width by 8 foot wide, and this example that I have right here is for beans. Okay, and these are just little shapes that you can edit. And the bean example here, this is what, by planting the rows across the width of the bed versus the length of the bed. Does that kind of make sense when you look at this tool now? Because if we go back to beans on here, it looks like for the beans, there should be 6 rows per bed if that is a fully planted raised bed. Okay, so as you can see here, it's 6. And I like to have this visualization tool for if you make beds like this rather than in long rows or long beds, like in-ground beds, because then you can visualize how you can easily plant in here a little bit better this way. Because if there's a structure to this, like this is actual wooden 4 by 8 foot structure, it's a little bit easier to plant tightly spaced rows across the width of the bed rather than doing it down the length of the bed. Okay, now that's not necessarily the case for everything. There are a couple exceptions, and that's why I put 48 inches for a couple things. And those actual few things where it's different, I believe, is actually cucumbers. Because for cucumbers, in this system, for me, now Phil, you may have your cucumbers planted differently, but for me, or your sort of the way that you trellis and plant might be different. But for this system, what I would do is actually plant down the length of the bed, the long ways, and primarily just use the back of that particular raised bed and trellis it vertically to a trellising structure. And then use the rest of the space in the front for some quicker growing crops like radishes. And the same thing would apply to tomatoes. So cucumbers and tomatoes, at least in the way that I would do it and approach it for this system, is planted along the length of the bed and the back of the bed. Okay, so that's why I have in this particular setup those 2 different spacings for the bed width. So just so not to confuse you. For our normal outdoor production, if you have just one, if you have in-ground beds or all of your beds are going to be 30 inches and you're just going to plant down the length of it like you normally would in an outdoor setup, you could just have one bed width. But for me, I've customized this field spacing and yield for 4 by 8 foot raised bed and for planting different crops in different ways, whether it's down the width or down the length of the bed. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's see here. So in 3, I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. Yep, and everything I just said there is kind of I have under 3A, B, and C, and using that bed layout tool, you can kind of see what might work best for different crops. You know, you can orient those shapes that I just set those shapes up like circles. The green circles are for large transplants, and those long green strips are for crops that you might direct seed or plant in really tight rows. So number 4 says start with the raised bed master. So the next sheet that we see, there's a raised bed master sheet, and we're going to kind of look at that next. And then you can break that sheet into a number of different sheets. And as you go along here, you have the master sheet. The next sheet you have is the succession master sheet. Then I have proviso high tunnel planting. So this is, I'll kind of explain why I did that. Then I have a transplanting schedule. Then I have a master plant schedule. And then I actually have a raised bed need master and a raised bed need for 2016. Okay, so I'll explain each one of those. So just a few tips before we start getting into this. If you're going to edit a non-blue box, like I said before, make sure that you really understand what the equation is doing before you make any changes, because those other cells have formulas in them that affect other cells, or they pull data from another sheet, like that field and spacing sheet. A lot of the equations that you're going to see here are pulling data directly from that field and spacing sheet. Okay, if you're attempting to copy and paste something from one sheet into a new sheet, and you want to keep the equations that you have embedded in those cells, you have to make sure that you paste special and keep formulas and formatting. Otherwise, just paste the values only. But if you need to make adjustments in your master sheet, you'll have to do it manually. So you'll kind of, as we move through this, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about there. But that means when you start with this master sheet that has all these equations, if you're just going to pull out a certain part of the spreadsheet and put it into a new sheet to simplify it, and you want to keep the equations that are embedded within the cells, you need to make sure that you paste special. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Excel, when you right click, there's options, after you copy a bunch of cells to either just paste or paste special. And when you hit paste special, there's a number of different things that you can do. But keeping the formulas and the formatting from the original sheet is important if you don't want to change the way the data looks or the functioning of the different formulas. Number 3, this tip is really important and can save you a lot of time. When you're entering planting dates, make sure that they're all in the current year, or else when you move on and you try to sort the data based on, greenhouse planting date or when you're direct seeding in the field, it won't sort the data correctly, because if you have one date from 2015 and another date from 2016, it's gonna mess up the chronology of the planting dates when you're sorting them. So that's something that I have to change every single year, as you can see here, that I don't have that automatically adjustable in here. You have to change the planting dates every single year, and make sure you update it to the current year, or else when you go to sort a number of these different fields, it sorts it chronologically. It can save you a bunch of time, because you may have spent a lot of time putting together a transplant production sheet, and you didn't change the planting dates, and then you're going through it and all of a sudden one of them's out of place, and it's usually because you didn't change the dates and update it for the current year. Use the data sort function or the filter function to arrange dates in chronological order. So this is the reason why these spreadsheets are so powerful, is because the equations are already embedded. You just have to make slight adjustments from year to year. And then when you want to just pull out a bunch of data so you have a nice chronological list of when you need to either start plants inside or plant them out in the field, you can just pull that out and sort it by that date, and it gives you a chronological list of when you need to be hitting your planting dates. Okay. Record actual planting dates and other info into a physical or digital record keeping tool, e.g. a clipboard or an iPad, for future adjustments and future edits and plan adjustments. What I mean by that is, so this is a great tool to digitize and sort of arrange all of your information, but as you'll see, this is going to spit out a bunch of dates, right? So you have a bunch of dates of when you might want to start your transplants indoors or direct seed outside. But what you might find is that those dates might not necessarily match up with your calendar schedule. So I find it really useful to have an actual physical calendar that you can write all these dates down on, or at least kind of cross-check it to say, oh, I have this planting date on Saturday, March 19th. But I'm going to be doing this on Saturday, March 19th. So you can look at that and make a quick adjustment by a day or two so you can adjust it. Or rain or weather might prevent you from planting or doing something out in the field. That way you can actually physically write down when you actually did something so you can later go back and adjust it. Okay? Let's see here. Adjust your cells and trays based on the transplant production system you like. Okay, so as we move through the spreadsheet, you're going to see that there's a bunch of stuff that you can change, and I have a lot of those columns highlighted so you can adjust it to your specific system. Days to maturity in these sheets. Okay, so that's the days from either when you're putting the seed in the ground or when you're putting the transplants in the ground to when you're actually going to get your first harvest. So in this sheet, they're based on some average examples and some records, but you can feel free to adjust those dates to reflect your specific varieties that you might be selecting for a type of crop, or your bioregion. Maybe you have a slightly different microclimate, or you're going to plant a couple days later. You can adjust those dates as well based on that. So again, the last tip is that these dates and metrics are guidelines to keep you on track. So weather and other unforeseen things are definitely going to throw you off, but at least having an action plan or a planning system in place will keep your production schedules moving forward and keep records. So make sure that you're also keeping records. And I'll give you some templates that you can modify and change according to suit your needs. So you can keep actual physical records. So, writing this stuff on a calendar and still keeping records with a clipboard is still super important. But this is just kind of a plan that you can use to to start with. Okay, and then there's another. I think I have this the bed feet to yield calculator. That's a separate tool. I think I have that in here. That's this tool. So this is, I don't use this very often, but I'll just kind of point out that it's there, where this is also based on that field spacing and yield sheet. So you can just enter, you could enter in like for arugula, or let's go down to cucumbers because that's what Phil's doing. Say you have a 4-foot bed, you press 4 in, and that gives you an approximate projected yield from that bed. Okay, that's all that is. It's a real simple tool. I don't really use it that much, but it's there. It was there because this spreadsheet was actually given to me from the Michigan State University Organic Farm, and I've sort of adapted over the years to my own use. They used it. You could use it. It's a real simple tool to kind of project your yield if you want to do that based on those parameters in that field spacing and yield sheet. But I don't necessarily use it. I just wanted to point out that it's there and that it's not actually pulling anything. You're asking if that's a square foot measurement. So what that is, so I just punched in bed feet, 4 feet, and that's based on this equation. So if you look at the formula bar, it's taking 4 feet times H27 in the field spacing and yield sheet. So let's look at H27 in that sheet. H27 is the yield per bed foot, which that is based on G times E, which, yeah, that's based on the size of your bed unit, right? So if you have a preset bed width for your raised bed unit and you have that plugged into the field spacing and yield sheet, and you want to use the bed to yield field calculator, yeah, you could just simply, what if I just plant 4 bed feet or 16 bed feet? What's going to be my projected yield based on that? So yeah, that would be a reflection of that in that case. I just don't really use the tool that much because you'll see here, that might be useful for you because you're just kind of just specifically growing cucumbers. But for when you're growing a number of different crops, you'll see embedded in these master and succession master sheets that some of that information's kind of already in there. So let's sort of move to that now. Okay, so we're just going to kind of go through this. So this first sheet that you should see here is called the master planting sheet. And we'll just kind of go through over each one of these columns, and I'll kind of explain it to you and explain the ones that I've put in here and why I put them in there. And you can just kind of see how this works. Okay, so if you look at in the first column, it says crop. And I have a little sub parentheses where I put crop can be divided into successions. So for those of you that don't know what a succession is, if you're confused on what I mean by that is for some crops, particularly like fast-growing crops, like say radishes, or even some longer, medium-growing crops like bush beans, carrots. All of those usually are crops that are succession planted, meaning that you plant multiple plantings of those throughout a given season. So you can sort of stagger the amount that you're harvesting over a longer period of time. You're not just planting it once. There are some crops that we are just planting once. So this, like crop 32 is eggplant, for instance. We don't really do a succession of eggplant. Or tomatoes. We do actually do a succession of tomatoes, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's not the same succession as a succession of bush beans or carrots. So in this particular sheet, there is some subdivision going on. So some of the crops will say like arugula early and late. And what I mean by that is that arugula is a cool season crop that can be planted both in the spring and also in the fall. So early usually represents planting out early in the spring, and late would be a planting time for that crop in the late summer, early fall for a fall crop. And then for other things like bush beans, usually growers will just have a succession of bush beans, and in this particular sheet I have the succession already built into this first master sheet. And for Phil, in your case, for cucumbers, there's also a succession for cucumbers. And for my methodology, I have 3 successions of cucumbers. So there's an early planting, a mid planting, and a late planting. Okay, and you could even break that down even further if you wanted to. Subdivide that even more based on the amount of cucumbers that you forecast that you're going to need for your pickling operation, for instance. Okay, but this template is for a very diversified farm growing a bunch of different things. But again, this could easily apply to your diversified kitchen garden or a small scale community garden, or if you're in the case of a food pantry. The reason why I've wanted to adapt this for that is because what you could have here in column B and C So here is where we have the number of weeks that you might be harvesting a crop, and then the amount that you're harvesting per week. Now, say, for instance, in your business plan, you have those columns that represent the amount that you're trying to sell at a market, but you could easily insert another column next to here that includes say you want to donate 10% or you want to grow an extra 10% that you're going to donate. You could easily add in another column to represent a different market or amount that you want to donate. And then that you could just plug that in to some of these equations to get in column E it says need, that's the full amount that you need, and then it moves on from there. So I thought a tool like this would be good for the Share the Harvest network, because even though they're a network of community gardens and they're working with food pantries and food banks, it would be really nice if the volunteers and workers at a community kitchen or food bank could sort of let a group of community gardeners know, maybe give them some metrics in terms of this is when we might want cabbage and how much we would want during a certain time of the year. So if you had that information from the food kitchen, you could easily plug that into this column B or C, and it would spit out all the information to the right that you need to help you plan your season. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but let's just move on from there. So crop list in column A. Now, as you move over, that's the number of weeks that you might want to bring that crop to market, or the number of weeks that you might want to be donating, number of weeks that you might want to be harvesting for your own personal use. Column C represents the amount per week that you want to harvest. Column D is the unit, and column E represents the total amount. So if you look at arugula in the spring, I want to try to harvest arugula over 6 weeks, a half a pound per week, for a total of 3 pounds. Okay? So we'll just keep moving off to the side. So as you can see, if you look up at the formula bar towards the top, these are all inputs, right? So these are things you could easily change. You could easily, so here the need, that's the first equation, but it's a simple equation. It's just column B times C to get the total need. Now as we move over, I'm just going to move over quickly. You can start to see, if you look in the column bar, that the equations are getting more and more complicated. But every time I get on a highlighted column that's blue, it's not complicated, and that's just an input that you can change. So the ones we can see here on this screen, the number of weeks, the amount per week, the DS versus TP means if you're direct seeding, which means putting the seed directly in the ground, or transplanting. And now you could look down that list, and maybe you direct seed some things, maybe you transplant other things. You could change that depending on the system that you use. And then seeds per tray. Now, if you are doing transplanting, then and you use a certain type of tray, then you might want to change the cells that you have per tray. So for instance, I like to use 128 cell trays for a lot of things. You can see as I go down this column here, I use 128 cell trays for a lot. So for something like cucumbers, I transplant cucumbers. You can see it says TP. Some people direct seed cucumbers, and you could easily do that. So say, for instance, you wanted to change that. I changed it to direct seeding, and what it does, it zeroes out all that transplant information, and the next information that you have as you move over, well, that will still be there, obviously, but you're not growing any transplants, you're not seeding indoors, but you move right over to the field plant date, which I have. My first field plant date for cucumbers would be May 15th. So I could go back and just change it to TP, and that information pops back up, the number of trays that I need, the greenhouse seeding date. So you can see how you can change some of these columns and it automatically adjust as you move over. Okay? So are there any questions so far from those of us that are looking at the presentation? I know this is a lot, but I'm just trying to kind of go through it just to kind of get through as much as I can. Is it kind of making sense so far from what you're looking at? Yeah?
I have a question for you, Zach.
Yeah, what's up, Phil?
All the input that you have in here, this is real stuff from your experience over the past 6-7 years, like in this climate.
Yeah. So exactly. So I guess I would say that, yeah, this is from a bunch of different records that I've kept over a number of years, and also just me looking at different resources just to kind of cross-check some of it, like the field planting dates. And I might also be looking at old records for when I planted out in the field, or maybe when I planted in the greenhouse, and making adjustments based on that. So right, when we look at the field plant dates in column R over here, all of those dates are primarily based for hardiness zone 5B, which is what we're in, or 6A, which there's a little bit of a microclimate as you get closer to the lake in Cook County. That's a little
Hmm.
bit warmer. And if you want to make an adjustment either a week or a few days on either side of the dates that I have here, you can feel free to do that. Um, but these are just dates that I feel pretty comfortable with based on my experience. And I actually think for this particular planner, I was taking into consideration those potential microclimates. So these dates are pretty solid. I mean, you could adjust them by a few days or maybe even a week if you want, depending on what it is. Like if it's a warm season crop, I mean, if you feel comfortable looking at the 10-day forecast that, we're not going to get any significant frost, like for instance, for the cucumbers, for instance, right? Like if you, May 15th, would be a date that I would be looking to set out my first transplants of cucumbers in the ground, in the peat pots. Now, you know, that's a quick growing transplant when you're growing cucumbers as a transplant. It's only in the pot for 15 days. So during that 15-day span, if the weather's looking good, and it doesn't look like in the 10-day it's going to dip down or get anywhere close to freezing 32 degrees, then you could adjust that. But I tend to try to stick to that schedule unless something is in the 10-day forecast is telling me otherwise. And then if you do change that planting date, make a note of it, and you can kind of think about that when you're planning for the next year. If that date worked, if it was too early, if it was too late, so on and so forth. But yeah, this is the field planting dates, the days to maturity. All of that is in general based on where we're sitting right now. If we were, two hardiness zones to the south, all those inputs would change. So yes, that's a good question. It is based on that. But again, for instance, like cucumbers is a good example because a lot of people will just direct seed cucumbers. That's a perfectly legitimate way of doing that. But I personally am a big fan of, as you can see, if you look at column H, I'm a big fan of transplanting as much as you possibly can, given the parameter that you have the space to start those transplants. A lot of people might not have transplant production space, so they might end up direct seeding instead. But I tend to try to start transplants, and the reason why I do is because that's almost guaranteeing that you're going to get that crop off to a good start. It's going to survive its first few weeks. You might be hardening it off before you're setting it out, but as soon as you set it out into that nicely prepared, ready to go bed, it's just going to take off. Okay? And cucumbers are a good example of something that the transplant, they don't like to be handled too much when you're transplanting them. So if they're in a plug tray or something like that and you're trying to pull them out, they don't really like to be handled too much. So for the transplants for the cucumbers, it says 18 cells per tray. And I don't have a note of this in here, but the type of pots that I use, I like to use peat pots. 18, the amount, they're like 2 or 3 inches wide, 3 inches tall. And I can fit about 18 of those in a 10 by 12 standard like flat tray that you'd buy at a garden center. So that's why I have 18 in there, because I know I can fit 18 in there, and I usually like to use the peat pots because I can just plant the whole peat pot in the ground below the soil and not disturb the roots, and the cucumber will take off. Okay, but cucumber is a good example of you could do it either way, direct seed or transplant. But in my case, I like to do as many transplants as I can, so I transplant. And you'll look at there's some other odd ones in here, like beets, for instance. I transplant all of my beets. A lot of people direct seed beets, which is fine, but with beets, if you plant them too early or the soil temperature is not right or it's too wet, it can take them a long time to germinate. So if I can start them in 128 cell plug trays on a heat mat under some lights or on my windowsill or in my greenhouse, I can get them off to a real quick start, grow them in there for about 4 weeks, and then set them out in the garden. And they take off, and they transplant very well. There are some things that you can't direct transplant very well. Beans aren't very good at. They don't respond well to transplanting, so I don't do that. Carrots, you can't. They have a taproot, so you can't transplant those. Radishes, garlic. Garlic, you're planting a bulb. It's not quite like planting a seed. So So those are just some examples. Okay, but you can switch that. That's a column. The reason why I have it highlighted in blue is because you can change that if you want. Okay, so let's just kind of keep moving over, um, so we can get through most of this. Um, so the amount that you need, the row feet that you need, so that's already built in. You don't really need to mess with that. The bed feet that you need, whether you're direct seeding or transplanting, that's column H. Column I, individual transplants needed. Okay, so that's the amount of transplants that you need to grow in order to get that total amount that you need, that you have pre-calculated on the left side of the spreadsheet. The number, so in column J, I wanted to make a note here because this is a column that wasn't initially in the first spreadsheet. So this is the number of 4 by 8 foot raised beds. Now this is something that I don't have highlighted as blue, but if you have a different sized raised bed, like say for instance all of your raised beds are 4 by 4, or you do 4 by 12 foot raised beds, you might need to adjust that. Okay, so if you look at that equation, what I have there is, for arugula, I'm highlighting it. It says G2, which is the number of bed feet for that of arugula that I need, divided by 4. And the reason why it's divided by 4 is because for that crop, that's the length of bed that I have, right? Remember I was showing you how we plant a lot of crops across the width of the bed? So because it's only 4 feet in length of total bed feet that we have, that's our raised bed unit. So now I know when I have that equation there that I need exactly, for all my arugula for the early planting to get 3 pounds, I need to plant about a half of a raised bed to do that. Okay? So that's why I have that equation there, because I like to know I can sum up. This is a really functional column, because if you have all that calculated for everything, you go to the bottom of this and you see down here at the bottom, I have summed up 38 raised beds. So for this particular crop plan, I know that for everything, just if I wanted to plant it just like this and not take into account all the planting dates, because there's staggered planting dates. Some of this we're planting in the spring, some of it in the summer, some in the fall. If I planted all this at once, I would need a total of 40 raised beds. Now you're going to see how when we move across here that you actually wouldn't need a total of 40 raised beds, because we're not planting all of this at once. This is gradually being planted over a calendar year. So, but that's a piece of information that you could change. It's a real simple equation. All you'd have to do is adjust the length of your bed. Okay. Now, if you look, remember how I said cucumbers? Cucumbers should be 8 feet. Oh, no, it's not. I have it as 4 feet. I think I would need to adjust that actually, because that's not right. Mary's asking, is the calculation the same for the whole column? It should be, right? So if I'm going down it right now, everything's based on a 4-foot bed length.
Energy, no more beds. No, everything we tried failed except the Dynavite.
So yeah, I have it all based on 4, but I actually should have the tomatoes and cucumbers as 8 feet. Okay, I didn't change it for this one, but I should, because I plant the cucumbers and tomatoes slightly different. Okay, so that's.
I can't hear the question. I'm
Yep.
sorry, Zach.
Yep.
I couldn't hear the question that was asked. Can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry. She was asking, is the calculation the same for the whole column in that case? And what I was saying was, in general, it should be. Like if you planted all of your crops and all of your rows down the length of the bed or the width of the bed, whichever way you did it, yes, it should be the same. But because I do 2 different things, I have 2 different setups. Hold on a second. Okay, I just had to mute something really quick. I could hear it. So for that particular column, for column J, right, for the cucumbers, remember I said I plant those down the length of the bed and not the width of the bed? This should be 8 in this case. I don't have it. I didn't make the adjustment, but you can make it internally. But if you plant everything the same, if you're planting everything down the length of your beds, then you can keep it all the same. But yeah, it's a real quick adjustment. So that's a simple equation. That's just the number of total bed feet divided by the length of your bed. And for most of the crops in here, based on my 4 by 8 foot raised bed, the length of the bed is 4 feet. So that just gives you a general idea of how much bed space or how much of your raised bed you're going to need in order to plant 3 pounds of arugula in the case of that arugula early at the top there. Okay, so let's keep moving over. So if you look at arugula, the cells per tray, seeds per tray, number of trays you need, the greenhouse seeding date, all of that is blank because that is a crop that we direct seed. Okay, so the only thing that we need, the next thing we need in that case, if you go over to column R, it says field plant date. And for the arugula, I have April 3rd. That's my target date when I'm trying to plant arugula in my bed in my field. Now you might want to try to get in there earlier. You could probably even right now try to go out there and plant arugula because that's a cool hardy crop. It can be planted like as soon as the ground gets worked. So you could adjust it. You could adjust this date to right now if you wanted to. Okay, but that's just the target date that I have set at the beginning of the year that I'm trying to hit that target date of April 3rd to plant in the field. Okay, and that applies for all the crops. In general, you might be looking at a chart, you might be using this template, but you might have another chart where you like to plant your arugula on a different date. You can by any means adjust that. By all means adjust that. So the next column is days to maturity. So again, like I was saying, this is just a generality. So for arugula, to reach full maturity, it's probably about 30 or 40 days. In 30 days, it'll probably be a little smaller. If you waited 40 days, it'll get a little bit bigger. The next column over is the first harvest date. So based on that planting date and that days to maturity, May 3rd is when you should expect to see a first harvest. So you can see here, this is a lot of really good information. So I may actually want to copy out the crop column and just take out the field plant date, days to maturity, and first harvest date and put that into a separate sheet. Okay, and I've done that, and we're going to see that in a second. And then reorganize that based on when the first harvest date for all these crops are. Then what do I have? I essentially now have a calendar that tells me the rough dates of when I'm going to be expecting to harvest all these different crops. So you could either just refer to that in the spreadsheet form, or you could plug those dates into a calendar and give that to the chef that you're working with, give that to the food pantry that you're working with, or just use it for yourself so you know when you can expect to harvest that particular crop. Okay, it's a loose date, it's not always exact, and again, keeping records of when you actually do harvest, you can make adjustments as you move forward. Okay, so the rest of the spreadsheet, at least this master spreadsheet, so from columns U all the way over, the rest of this information is actually there to get you a seed order, right? Because ultimately, at the end of this spreadsheet, what you want to know is that you know how much you want to plant, how much per week you need, when you're going to plant it. But now you need to know how much seed do I need to have to get that amount out at the end, and that's what the rest of these columns are for. So I don't have any. I didn't highlight these in blue. That still doesn't mean that you couldn't adjust them. So, for instance, I like to use Johnny's selected seeds for a lot of the seeds that I order. I'm not saying, I'm not endorsing them by any means. You could use whoever you want, but one of the reasons why I like to use Johnny's is because in their catalog they actually have a bunch of what they call cultural information, and what that means is for each crop on each page when you're looking through the seed catalog, it tells you information about, it'll say seed specs, the number of seeds per ounce, or the amount of seed that you need to plant 100 row feet. So all that information in column U is actually sourced from something like Johnny's Selected Seeds. So for instance, for arugula, to plant 100 row feet of arugula, I would need about 0.4 ounces of seed. Okay, so that's just a standard that the rest of the spreadsheet bases that off of to get the amount of seed that you need for what you're trying to project or grow, which, if you remember all the way back here, is 3 pounds of arugula on 2 bed feet, essentially. So let's just go all the way over to the right to see how much seed that we would need. So we're trying to plant 2 bed feet, which is roughly half of a 4 by 8 foot raised bed. And for that amount, if you go all the way over, you would need approximately 0.13 ounces to do that. Okay, so 0.13 ounces, you're thinking like, how, that's not how it gets sold. And when you look at it in the catalogs, that's true, but at least it's some form of a reference so you know how much you need. And if you look at a lot of seed catalogs, will tell you how much a packet weighs in grams or in ounces, so you can kind of get an idea. So if you know that you need 0.13 ounces of seed to get that amount, then you can kind of just look at the information on the seed packet or in the seed catalog and roughly get an idea of how much you need to order. Now, if you look over here, what I also have in column AG is the seed that you may have from previous years. Okay, so you may you may have collected some seed, or you may just have a little bit of seed left over. And if it's viable still, like some seed, like onions, for instance, you usually can't save onion seed more than a year, or else it won't. You only get like 50% of it to germinate. But some things like arugula, for instance, if you store arugula in your refrigerator, or you keep the temperature and the relative humidity combined below 80. So say it's 40 degrees in your cooler or your refrigerator and 40% humidity, that's at 80 or below. That seed will last for up to probably 4 to 5 years. Okay, so you might have to order. So say in your packet that you order 1 year, you order a packet of arugula seeds, and it's 3 times the amount that you need for the area that you're going to plant. That's okay, because you can save that seed for subsequent years, and you won't need to order arugula seed for next year, because you're going to store it in your refrigerator and account for it in this column AG. So here you can see in column AH, I don't need to order any arugula seed because I know I have a ½ ounce of arugula seed already that's viable. So I actually have enough arugula seed probably for 2 years. Okay, so this is a good way to keep track of the seed that you have on hand, so you don't order too much seed. Okay, does that make sense? So ultimately, that's the end of this master spreadsheet. I know that's a lot of information. You can see that's over 30 columns worth of information. Okay, so what you can do when you have a whole bunch of information like this is you can sort of subdivide this now into certain relevant categories. So as we look at the bottom here of the spreadsheet, the next sheet that I have is something called Succession Master 2016. Okay, so before I go to that, you'll notice some of the crops in column A are already broken up into succession plantings, but some of them aren't. For instance, if you go all the way to the bottom here, I have mesclun solid mix, and an asterisk by that indicating that you can break that down into successions. I probably have, at the student farm, for instance, we probably had 20 different succession plantings throughout the year. So that's a lot of information to put on this master sheet, but you might want to create another sheet where you actually flesh out all those succession plantings, and that's what the Succession Master 2016 is. So let's click on that. So now, if I scroll to the top, it looks relatively the same as the previous sheet, but now I've just entered in, if you look over here in column A, if you look on the previous sheet, I just had 2 successions for arugula, one for early plantings and one for late plantings. Now I've broken that down into 4 successions, okay? 4 plantings of arugula. And if you look over here at the field plant date on the right, the first planting will be April 3rd. Then I have another one 10 days later. And then after that planting, I'm not going to do any more planting of the arugula until August 23rd and then September 1st, because that corresponds with the fall planting. But I've just fleshed this out a little bit more, so it's a little bit more specific detail about when exactly I'm planting all 4 of those plantings of arugula. Okay, now this might seem a little type A and too specific, but trust me, if you flesh all this detail out and then you have all those specific field planting dates in column S and you sort that, and you're going to see me sort that in a different sheet here in a minute, you have a chronological calendar of when you need to, at least some target dates, and when you need to plant everything for the entire season. So it takes all of the guesswork out of when you think you should be planting something based on a chart that you've got online or in a gardening book that you have. You've already done the homework. Everything's in place. All you need to do now is just sort it by field plant date, and you have that ready to go. So as we move down, everything's fleshed out. I have 4 plantings of Asian greens, which is like bok choy, 4 plantings of basil. The bush beans were already successioned out, so I didn't change anything. 5 plantings of that. 6 plantings of beets. So 3 plantings early in spring, and then I have a few more plantings in the late summer, early fall for a fall crop, and that goes on and on. So broccoli, I have 4 different plantings for broccoli. Cabbage, just 2 plantings for cabbage. I don't have a succession for cabbage. For carrots, 7 different plantings of carrots. So you see how I've broken this down into much more detail. So this represents every single planting that I'm going to do. Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
don't know if everybody else is seeing the same thing, but the presentation is saying the network and issues have interrupted the presentation. I can't see the spreadsheet anymore.
Okay, let me see if I can figure that out.
I can still
Anybody
see
else?
it.
You can still see it? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, Phil,
Mary.
looks like you are should still be able to see it. It might pop back in a second. Is anyone else not seeing it? Let's see who else is on. Susan can't see it anyway. There was someone else who joined in, but I think they popped out. Can you? Is it not?
There's a refresh or something. Maybe?
Yeah. Oh wait. Let me see. Oh, Mary, she popped out for a second.
No, I'm here.
You're here. Yeah, it's saying that your audio quality is bad, but it's still saying that you're seeing it. And Phil, yours it's saying that you're seeing it. You might want to pop out really quick if you can't see it and pop back in because it's actually probably the connection on your end that's preventing it. Because my network quality is good. Yeah, go ahead.
At Precious Blood, right now their beds are 3 by 12.
Okay.
So I would have to change the one computation, but we're planning on building new beds.
Right.
Would you suggest for ease, even though that's not my favorite size bed, to keep them the same sizes?
Personally, I would.
Okay.
I mean, I know community gardens and smaller community food systems, it varies. You know, lots of people have earth pots that are circular, and then they may have a few like growing tables over here. So for a setup, a community garden that has a bunch of different size beds, a spreadsheet like this, it kind of complicates it a little bit. But yeah, if you can standardize your bed unit as much as possible, it really makes it a lot easier.
Okay, even though that's not what you might have started with.
Right. So, I mean, for instance, in your case, you have some beds that are 3 feet wide by 12 feet long, and say
Right.
you have some other ones later on that are 4 feet wide by 12 feet long. You
Right.
can just go to the field spacing and just again, I just pulled it up. You can see this. You can just make 2 different bed widths for the 2 different spacings. And then, I mean, it does complicate things a little bit because then you have to think about, oh, am I planting arugula in this size bed and then beans in this other size bed? So it does complicate things a little bit. But I
Okay.
still think, in general, you could figure out a way to make it work. You might have to think about it a little bit. I'm trying to think if there's. I don't have a simple answer for you.
Okay,
In terms
no,
of,
that helps though.
yeah, I mean, this is. I spent a little time talking about that column A right there, because when I was approaching this from like a 4 by 8 size like raised bed that I would build for a community garden or urban food farming system, it did complicate it a little bit for me because I realized that there were some crops, like when we were looking at that bed visualization tool, that I was planting across the width, and some of them that I was going down the length of the bed. Whereas, like in a normal food production setup for a small farm, like an outdoor setup, like an in-ground setup, you know, all the beds would be the same width, and in general, you'd probably have about the same bed length, right? Or you would try to standardize your units to make it as easy as possible. And then a spreadsheet like this would work well for you. So if you have a bunch of unit sizes for all of your beds, it kind of makes it a little bit more complex, but you still could use this more or less. Particularly if everything, really, this field and spacing sheet is really just based on if you have a standard bed width. So, I mean, in your case, I mean, what is it about the 3 by 12s that you don't like? Do you not like the width or do you not like the length?
Well, I don't like the width. I mean, I think it's more efficient to have a 4-foot width.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's hard to say. I think I can't say for certain why I started with the 4-foot wide bed. I think part of it has to do with because I actually build these mini tunnels that we actually use to extend the season on our 4-by-8 foot raised beds, and they work really well with that 4-foot width. But honestly, I probably would, move to a narrower width in general because it's easier to get to reach across a 3-foot bed than is a 4-foot bed, right? When at the student farm, all of our bed widths, we had 30-inch wide beds, so that's 2.5 feet. That was a preferred width because they were just really easy to step over. They're really easy to, straddle if you're harvesting that way. Whereas a 4 foot wide bed is actually a little bit more difficult to straddle, to reach across. Usually a 4 foot wide bed in a more commercial farming setup is set up for tractor production rather than hand production. So actually, I mean, if I were you personally and I had a bunch of 3 by 12 foot beds, I would actually probably stick with that
Even if we
size.
wanted to do high tunnels on some of the others.
Well, I think I'd have to look at your specific design, and I could probably make a suggestion for how you could adapt something for your specific setup.
Okay.
The bending jigs that I use and the ones that I make work a little bit better for 4 feet, but you could adapt it for 3 feet. There's a way that you could do it.
Okay, thanks.
So it looks like we have someone else on. It looks like Ariel is on. Ariel, can you hear everything and see the spreadsheet? You're muted, or you can just type in the IM box. Phil, are you back? Can you see again?
I'm back.
And can you see the spreadsheet again?
Yep, I've got everything.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Okay.
So Ariel, I see that you're on. There's an option.
Mother-in-law.
Yes,
or
I can
whatever
see
that is.
everything.
Okay, you can see everything. Good. So I'm actually recording this, and we've talked in great detail about this. So I'm just going to keep going, and I can send you the recorded presentation of this, so you have some more detail about it. But we're just going to continue on with where we left off.
Okay.
Okay, so back to the Succession Master 2016. So again, this is everything's really fleshed out here into all the different successions. As you look at the crop column in column A, I've got everything in here, okay? So all my different successions, all my carrot plantings, moving down all the different, I have 3 different cucumbers plantings. I'm only planting eggplant once, but look at lettuce. I have 8 different plantings for lettuce, some in the spring, some in the fall, that early and late. And then I want to show you, I want to get down to the mesclun salad mix. So that's the reason why we have the sheet here. So if you look at row 106 all the way down to row 25, you can see I have 20 different plantings throughout the season, where I'm planting mesclun or a baby salad green mix. The blue ones that I have highlighted, those are actually plantings that I would be doing with a season extension structure. So we were just talking a little bit about that. If you look at those dates, if you go over to the right and look at column S, February 4th as a planting date for mesclun or salad mix. Outdoors, you can't plant on February 4th. But if you have a season extension structure like a mini hoop over your raised bed or a walk-in structure, you can plant a mesclun mix that early. So I just like to integrate those season extension planting dates with my outdoor planting dates. So I just have it in one nice uniform spreadsheet that I can later use to sort. Okay, so as you can see, there's a lot more detail with this succession planting sheet. So now that I have this all here, it's still not fleshed out into something that makes a little bit more sense. Okay, so as I moved over, the next sheet that I have is this Proviso High Tunnel Plantings 2016. So the reason why I made a whole additional sheet here specifically for the Proviso High Tunnel Planting sheet is because I have that master and succession master there. I don't want to mess with any of that, right? So say for instance, I don't want to plant arugula or beans or beets. Instead of just erasing all of those rows in my master sheets, I just zeroed it out, right? So here, if you look at Asian in row 8, Asian greens number 3, I zeroed that out. Okay, so now I don't have, I know for the next sheet we're going to look at the Proviso High Tunnel Plantings in 2016, I'm just not going to copy those over. Okay, so rather than mess with it, because it kind of messes things up if you start deleting a bunch of your rows and your formulas. So I prefer just to have a succession master where I have everything fleshed out for all the potential succession plantings that I could do. But let's say, for instance, for a specific site or a specific garden, I don't have enough space, or I just don't want to plant Asian greens in the fall. Just go ahead and in a number of weeks just zero that out in this sheet. And then when you start moving over to these other sheets, you just won't carry that information over. So in this case, I did that. So for the Proviso planting sheet, it simplifies it a little bit more. So now I just have, if you look at the crop column, there's fewer plantings here, right? So I'll go all the way down, and it looks like I only have 55 plantings for the Proviso high tunnel raised bed setup. And just really quickly, we'll just go over and look at and see what that setup looks like. So here's a mapping tool. So I also you can create in Excel, you could color out and create a little mapping tool. And in this case, what you're looking at is the 18 4x8 raised beds that are contained within the Proviso Giving Garden High Tunnel. Okay, so I know I only have 18 raised beds, so I made some adjustments to that succession master plan, so I could kind of reduce the amount of planting so it would fit in that space. Okay, so that's just I just wanted to show you that really quick as a visualization to see how many raised beds I'm working with this particular plan. Okay, so looking at the Proviso high tunnel plantings, hopefully throughout the whole calendar year, I'm going to be able to fit all these plantings in the Proviso tunnel. Okay, so still everything here is still arranged in alphabetical order according to the crop type. So I have the number of weeks, the amount I'm planting, the bed feet, if I'm direct seeding or transplanting, yada yada yada, moving all the way over. Now I still want to be able to organize some of this data in a chronological order to help me out. So the first thing that I do is I look at, like I said before, most of these crops I try to transplant. So I try to start them indoors or in my greenhouse, in my cold frame, in my windowsill ahead of time. So if I want to do that, what I need to do is just copy and paste all the transplanted items into a new sheet. Okay, so there's a couple ways that you could do that. One way is you could just copy and paste into a whole new sheet like I did here, or you could just click on row 1 and go up to sort and filter and click on filter, and in that case what that did was it applied these little drop down menus for each one of the columns, right? So for those of us familiar with Excel, we're familiar with this function. So in this case, say for instance what I want to do is just sort by transplant. I can just sort that A to Z, and that quickly organizes it into transplanting versus direct seeding. Does everyone see what happened there, why that did that? Now the next thing I might want to do is go over to the greenhouse indoor seeding date and sort oldest to newest based on that. Okay, that actually, what did that do? Okay, yeah, that worked. So what that did was is sorted all those crops in column A by the date here in column P that I need to start those crops indoors. So now they're all arranged in chronological order. So for that lettuce, for the first planting of lettuce that I'm going to plant in the high tunnel, I needed to start those lettuce transplants on February 20th. Okay, and you can move down that list, and that gives you a nice chronological list of when you need to start all of your transplants. And then you'll notice those should all be transplants. I don't know why some of those have direct seeding dates in them too, but they shouldn't. I don't normally do it this way. I just wanted to show you that it's possible to do it this way. Normally what I do is I'll delete the filter. I'll just actually undo everything. Okay, undo that. We're back to where we were. Take the filter out. What I normally do is just take and just copy. I'll just copy out all of the transplanted stuff like this. Okay, so I'll just highlight a bunch. Control A, select all, copy all of it, and put it into a new sheet. So I just flipped over to a new sheet, and this sheet just represents all of the transplanted crops from the previous sheets. Okay, so and all the relevant information. So we obviously know everything in here is a transplant, but I also copied over all the individual transplants that I need, all the raised beds that the amount of raised beds I might need, and then some other information that is I'm not going to get into, but that I have in there that's specific. The cell type, the number of seeds per cell, the actual place. So I have some buffer information in here. But again, if we go over to column A, I reorganized everything into the greenhouse seeding date. That you would start those transplants indoors or in your greenhouse or under your lights in a chronological order. So I can use this as a separate sheet to keep me on track for all of my greenhouse planting dates. Okay, so if you look here, when this is sorted properly, right, so the very first thing I should have planted would have been the sweet peppers if I'm going to plant sweet peppers in the high tunnel, which you can plant sweet peppers in a high tunnel much earlier than you can outdoors because it's protected, and that's why that field planting date over here in column N is so early. Normally we wouldn't be planting peppers until May 15th or even maybe May 25th. But because we're planting in a high tunnel, we can plant them much earlier than we can outdoors, so that we need to adjust the greenhouse seeding date for that. And in this case, it's February 26th. So there's some other information that was in the other sheets as well, like the days from seeding to transplanting. And what that represents is how many days, for instance, a pepper transplant, when you put that pepper seed in the trays that you're starting the transplants in, how many days the transplant is in that cell before you set it out in the field. And in the case of a pepper transplant, it's 50 days, which is about 6 weeks. So now that could be changed. So that's a blue column that I highlighted. You could have a different system. For what I like to do, I actually like to start them in, so look at column F, in cells where there's 32 cells per 10 by 20 tray. Okay? Now, because of the volume of soil that holds, that's 32 cells in a relatively small square footage, I know that I can only hold those peppers in there for about 6 weeks before they start getting too big for those cells. So I time my greenhouse plantings based on that knowledge. Now, some people like to set out pepper transplants into say like 4-inch or 6-inch pots. Now, if that was the case, you could probably only fit 10 to 18 cells per tray, so you would adjust that number to 10. Let's say it's 10, for instance, right? Then you would adjust that. And then that also means that you could keep that pepper transplant in that cell a little bit longer, so you might adjust the number of days from seed to transplant. Okay? So in that case, it might be an 8-week transplant, which would mean you would put 54 days in there. Okay? And let's do that. And in that case, that changed the greenhouse seeding date by a week. Okay, so those are adjustments that you can make depending on the type of system that you have. But I'll just undo all of that. And for my particular system, we use 32 cell trays for peppers, and you can just go down and look. So same thing for hot peppers. For a lot of the things like the lettuce, scallions, chard, kale, kohlrabi beets, spinach, those things that we transplant, those need a much smaller soil volume. Okay, so we use 128 cells per tray. And those are usually only in there for 30 or 40 days, which is about 4 to 5 weeks at the most. So they're in a smaller amount of soil in those trays, but they're living in that space for a shorter period of time before we actually set those out. So again, this is all stuff that you could adjust. You don't necessarily have to follow this particular system, but this is just how I do it. I just wanted to give you some of the logic for why those numbers are that way. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? So all this is really useful information. I could print this out onto a sheet, have it on a clipboard, give it to one of my workers, one of my volunteers, one of my staff, so they have a good idea of what they need to do. I mean, you might need to train them on how to plant those seeds in that particular type of cell tray, but they know the schedule. They know that peppers need to be started on February 26th, and let's go all the way down. The second planting of cucumbers need to be started on April 16th. So it's a chronological order of when you need to start those seeds to stay on schedule for all of your field plant dates and all of your potential first harvesting dates. Okay. So again, all of this is adjustable. Obviously we're not going to be able to hit all these target dates, but if you have this in a spreadsheet form like this, you could go back when you're taking records, when you're actually planting, and adjust all of these dates, either in real time in the season or for the next year, you can make those adjustments. Okay? So this is just an example of how I pulled data from that master sheet and turned it into a transplant sheet. Now let's say we want to have a master planting schedule. So that's what I have here. So this is a simplified master planting schedule where I've taken all of the crops, regardless of if they're direct seeded or transplanted, put it into column A. I kept in column B, I put whether we are direct seeding or transplanting, so I know that info. And then here, all I have is the field plant date, the days to maturity, the first harvest date, and the number of raised beds that I need at that time, because that's going to come into play when we look at the next sheet. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
Yeah. I finally got home so I can see the spreadsheet.
Okay.
But now I got a message that you need to restart the sharing because the network interrupted the presentation.
Okay, that means you just need to exit out of it, because it's probably just
Okay.
on your end. Just exit out of it and come back in to the, just re-enter the webinar, and it should pull it back up.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure you should be okay if you do that. So here we're looking at the master plant schedule again. All this is again, I just took all that information out of one of the other master sheets, and I just sorted it by field plant date in column C that you can see here. I just highlighted it. So now I know that I'm trying to hit all these target field plant dates for all these different crops. So the first thing I should be planting would have been my radishes and my first mesclun baby salad green mix on February 29th.
Why is there a row or a column G there by the mesclun?
Oh, that's a sum. So sometimes I just like to sum up. So for instance, I was just looking to see like, oh, by March 10th, how many beds would I need by March 10th? And in that case, I just summed up. I'm sorry, I actually summed up all the way to April 14th for some reason. I just added that in there just to see how many raised beds I was going to need by April 14th for some reason. I don't remember why I did it, but I just did it. So I know, yeah, I'll actually just delete that. I know I don't need that in this particular case. But yeah, this is just a real simple sheet that I put together. So I just kind of have a nice chronological flow of when everything should be planted in the field, okay, whether it's direct seeding or transplant, okay? So that's all that is. And then this is a real nice thing to have because you could take those field plant dates and look at your big calendar that you have on your desk or your wall calendar and start maybe writing in some of those dates or looking at some of those dates to make sure it doesn't correspond with something else that you have going on. So you can kind of cross-check it with a physical calendar. I find that very useful to do both, okay? So this is just an example of a master plant schedule. Now this next sheet, this was something that I hadn't used before because normally when you're growing in beds in the ground in a normal field setup in the soil, you don't necessarily, you might want to track how much bed feet you might need tilled or bed units you might have tilled up or beds prepared, but you don't think of it normally this way. In terms of how many raised beds you might have and how much raised bed space you need during a certain period of time. So this next sheet that we're going to look at is what I'm calling a raised bed need master. Now this is going to look very confusing. I don't expect all of you to utilize this, but I found it a useful tool to kind of figure out how many raised beds I was going to need based on that crop plan that I have all the way over to the left, the Proviso high tunnel plantings for 2016. So I kind of fleshed that out. I took in the Proviso high tunnel plantings, I took out some of the plantings that knew I wasn't going to need or use, but in this raised bed need master and the raised bed need for 2016, I'm actually figuring out exactly how many raised beds I'm going to need and if my plan's going to work or not. So this is a little bit more complicated. And I just kind of just created this on my own, and it's a little confusing to look at, but essentially what it gets down to is a running bed total in column H here, and then the bed need in column H. So as the season, so I have this arranged over here in column B in chronological order of when things are going to be planted in the field and what the running bed total I'm going to need is, okay? So the equations are embedded in here. You might be able to adapt this to your specific need. But in this particular case, if we go to the next sheet, the raised bed need for 2016, yeah, that's what we have here. So if you look here, I have the field plant date, days of maturity, first harvest, the number of beds we needed, and then I actually, column G, this is something that wasn't in the previous columns that I added in. This is an approximation of when we might be done harvesting that particular bed, and that took a little bit of extra time. And if you look at that column, if you look at the formula bar and you go down, a lot of those dates are different. They range for anywhere from that crop being in that bed for 50 days, 45 days, some of them 80 days, like in carrots, for instance. Carrots occupy bed space for a long time, up to almost 3 months. So all that is accounted for in that done harvesting, okay? Now, if you take that coupled with when you planted it, you can kind of accumulate a running bed total, And then what I've done is I've created a separate equation that sums up not only the running bed total, but also when those beds are cleared. Okay? So that is also based off of when I'm done harvesting. Okay? So it looks kind of, this sounds very confusing, and it took me a while to kind of come up with this, but essentially I just put this in here because I wanted to figure out, as we look down here at bed need as we move down, if the amount of beds that I had in the Proviso High Tunnel Giving Garden High Tunnel was going to be enough. And in this case, if you look, we were running about a maximum of 18 to slightly under 19 raised beds. So this is taking into account the sort of chronology of when we're planting in those beds and when some of those beds might be harvested and cleared. And then you could replant that open space. Okay, so I hope that kind of makes sense, and that's what this sheet represents. And it just confirmed to me when I looked down here at the end of May, early June, that the maximum amount of beds I'm going to need for this particular plan is about 18 beds. So that confirms for me, okay, cool, I have enough beds. And then I actually made an adjustment. The reason why I have those red boxes highlighted, because I actually went back and made an adjustment after I did this calculation the first time, because I knew that I had some freed up space. It actually only said I needed about, I think, 13 beds for that initial planting plan. So now that I knew that, I said, oh, I'm only using up 13 beds over time throughout the season. I have 5 beds to play with. Maybe I'll go back and add in 5 beds someplace else to maximize the amount of beds that I have. Okay, so that's me getting really sort of complicated with this particular spreadsheet. You don't necessarily have to do it. Over time, with you using the amount of raised beds you have in the space, you'll kind of know how much you can plant for the given amount of space that you have. The reason why I have this sheet is because raised beds, in particular in these urban settings, they're a confined unit that is a certain width and a certain length. So if you have a business plan based on how much you need per week over a certain amount of time, it might be good to build a sheet like this so you can double check and make sure that you're not going to need to build more raised beds based on your plan, based on how much you plan on bringing to a farm stand or a restaurant or to a food pantry. So that's the reason why I have those 2 sheets there. You can kind of just look at those and kind of mess with them and see what I did. I could talk to you for probably another hour just kind of explaining in precise detail how this works, but I just kind of wanted to go over that a little bit. Let's see here. So that's that bed calculator, field spacing. We kind of went over that. So the bed visualization tool, again, this is just another thing that I put in here for you to use just to kind of, this. I have a bean example and a broccoli example in here. The bean example, because we're direct seeding the beans, I know that from the field spacing that I have for the 4x8, I know that I should be able to fit 6 rows per bed at max. So I know I'm going to plant that across the width, and I just want to visualize to make sure that you see how I'm moving these. You might not be able to see it in real time, but I'm actually moving these shapes that I created. And this is all to scale too. Those individual squares represent a square foot. So I know 4 squares by 8 squares. That's a scaled representation of my bed, just for me to kind of visualize if that cropping pattern is going to work. So I know based on this that 6 rows of bush beans planted the width of the raised bed, that's going to work fine. Down below that, I have a broccoli example where I know I'm setting out transplants, right? So I have, instead of planted direct seeded rows, I have broccoli transplant. So that's what the circle represents, a single transplant. So for broccoli, if I go back to the field and spacing, I know that I should be able to fit 6 rows per bed, or let me see here, 6 rows per bed, or 4 plants per bed foot. So when I look at the bed visualization tool, 4 plants per bed foot, that's pretty close. It looks like I'm actually only able to fit 3. But the reason why that is confusing is because the in-row spacing for broccoli is actually 18 inches, right? So I should only be able to fit 3 plants per 4 feet. If it was a 12-inch in-row spacing, I would be able to fit 4 plants per bed foot, and thus I'd be able to fit there'd be 4 broccoli transplants across down the width of the bed rather than 3. So I just want to, you just kind of use this to kind of visualize to see if it's all going to fit in place and figure out how you're going to maximize the use of that space to confirm that your field spacing and yield is working properly. That's the only reason why I have that tool there. I just thought it'd be useful for some people. For some people, it may not be useful. And then this last sheet that I have is the proviso giving tunnel. Again, I just showed you guys this. This was just a map of this particular site where I know I have 18 raised beds, okay? And this is just a blank template. You could use this as a record keeping tool as well. So, as you start moving through your master plant schedule here, February 19th, you could also, what you could do is maybe code each one of these plantings like as 1A or 1 or the letter A, and you could use that code and put that into your map here so you know where you're planting it that year, right? So maybe you want to rotate your crops the following year or move things around a little bit. You can keep track of it with a map like this. Okay, so are there any questions about that? Was a lot of information. Some of you, this might be way over your head, or you might be thinking, what is he crazy? I'm not going to do this. There's a lot here. Again, you could take this template and simplify it as much as you want, or you could make it super complicated and super detailed like I have. But I think using a spreadsheet like this and some of these visualization tools will really help you, especially in the winter when you're planning out your season, kind of visualize how everything's going to fit together. And as long as you have a plan in place, it's going to be really helpful. Even if you have to make adjustments in the middle of the growing season, it's good to have a plan in place. And then I also want to show you some record keeping templates that I have to kind of help you take some records during the growing season, and then you can use that information for when you want to input it into the spreadsheet during the off season. But are there any questions about this before I move on to a record keeping template really quick?
Zach, you're going to send this to all of us, right?
Yes. Anyone who wants this, I'm going to send this. I'm going to send this particular proviso copy to. And then you can make adjustments to it however you want. I just want to, I just think it's useful for me to show this to you guys and explain it to you rather than just sending you something like this. And
oh, no, I just wanted to make sure you were going to send it.
Oh yeah, yeah. If you want this, if everyone wants this, either confirm in the text box or say yes. And I will send it to you. If you don't think this is for you, then I don't have to send it to you. But yeah, I'll send it to anyone who wants it. Absolutely. I will send this to you. And you can make adjustments however you want. But I just kind of wanted to show you how I use it. And this is a much more simplified version. I have a much more complicated version of this that I adapted this from for a larger farm operation. So this is kind of scaled back a little bit. So let's look. I want to show you some templates that I like to use. I can also send you these. So I pulled up another spreadsheet here. This should be a different spreadsheet. This is called, I believe this file is called the SSF 2015 record sheet. So this is just from the Sustainable Student Farm. These are the record sheets templates that we use. So I actually printed these out. So these were record keeping templates that I used as a physical record keeping tool that I would later use to plug back into that spreadsheet that we just looked at. So I can send these to you as well, and you can just adapt these. So let's start with the one on the bottom left. So this is actually the greenhouse plant schedule. So this was something that I actually took from that transplant schedule that we just went over in that last spreadsheet, but I actually color coded it because you can see I have a bunch of different markets that we were planning for. We had a CSA, we had a farm stand, we sold to the dining halls, we had the high tunnel plantings, we had cut flowers. So I color coded all of it, and it was a really complicated spreadsheet, but I eventually sorted everything out into this really simple greenhouse seeding date chart that's all in chronological order. And this was something that I printed out, put it on a clipboard, and anyone who was working in the greenhouse starting these transplants, they could just check it off, make little notes on here, just as a nice little simple template. And this is something, again, that I made from that date. And again, this is just another simple a checklist. This was actually transplant day. This was when we were supposed to be setting transplants in the field. So this is just something that I could print out, put on a clipboard, and the field workers could just check it off to make sure that it was actually done. Same thing with a direct seeding schedule that I put together, color coded. This was a greenhouse map. This is something that I drew in another app and just took a picture of it. And I had all our benches labeled. You don't necessarily need to do this, but this was just something that I had in there. So here we go. Here's an example of a greenhouse record keeping sheet. So this was something that we used in conjunction with the printed out sheet from the master sheet that I just showed you, the color coded one. This is just a real simple template that you can use, to plug in when you actually did the greenhouse seeding, the crop variety, the number of trays, was it a complete tray, the tray size, number of seeds per cell, anything, and notes, labor hours. This is a little more of a complicated template, but you could take this and just take some of these columns out if you want, but it's just a basic template you can use to actually physically write this information down on. And then once you've done this for the year, you can go back and revisit this and use this information to adjust your planting spreadsheet. So this is a high tunnel planting sheet. So we differentiated our high tunnel planting sheet from the planting sheet we did for the field. We just had two different sheets, but it's virtually the same thing. So the date we planted in the high tunnel, the crop variety, it's a similar sort of thing. Where we planted it, we had bed numbers. This was something we did for our food safety traceability program. We actually labeled and had specific bed numbers for different areas of the farm. So you could easily do something like this as well. Is there a formula for labor hours that correlates to the amount of bed and or labor space? Okay, so I don't have, and even if I had the numbers for my specific setup, Phil, you would have to do something that reflects what you're doing at your operation. So the reason why I have this, this was something that I never was able to get my field workers or employees to always keep track of. But I encourage you to keep track of those records, because you could use that later on for your enterprise budgets or some of your financial statements that you and I discussed earlier before the presentation. So I just like to have a column in there, and ideally, if you're keeping really good records, you should be keeping track of your labor hour records as well. I mean, if you have a large crew of people, it's really difficult to make sure everyone keeps track of that. If you have a smaller group of people, or you're the only person keeping track of those records, then it's a little bit easier. I think that answers the question, the amount of crop and or bed space. Yeah, like I said, I don't have an exact formula. Again, this is just a record sheet, so you can make it an exact recording of how long it took you for your operation. So you can keep a running total of that every single year and have that record on file. That's why I have that in there. And just another space for notes or anything. And again, you can just adjust these however you want. So I actually have, this is labor hours. So yeah, we had a bunch of record keeping templates that we tried to use. Some of them didn't work. The other thing is, you want to try to integrate as many of these record keeping sheets as possible. So if there's redundancies in any of these spreadsheets for labor hours, you want to make sure that you can eliminate some of that. Field planting sheet. So again, this is just a very similar theme to some of these other sheets, but I can send these to you and you can sort of adapt these to this is a really important one, this field planting sheet, or just a planting sheet in general, because there's a lot of useful information in here. The field plant date, the crop that you used, the field, the bed that you planted it in, the in-row spacing, between-row spacing, because maybe you made an adjustment, right, in the field, and it worked, and maybe you have that note in here so you can go back and make that adjustment in your master field planting sheet at the end of the year. The number of rows you planted, bed feet planted, the days to maturity in your first harvest day. It's really important to keep track of this, because you can use this to, again, make adjustments in your master planting sheet. So it's good to physically write this information down, because later you can go back and make adjustments to the bigger master plan. So you might be thinking, can I digitize this? Can I do this on an iPad? Can I do this on a phone? Yeah, you absolutely could. But what I found is that it was really difficult to create a culture of capturing this information on an iPad or an iPhone. I found it much easier to physically write the information down. So have these sheets pens, clipboards, all the sheets in the locations where you need to capture the data, and just instill it in your volunteers, your employees, or yourself that you're going to capture this information every time you're doing this activity in those particular areas. And it seems, some of it might seem redundant. It might seem like it's a little bit more laborious to do this, but trust me, if you have these records at the end of the year, you're going to be really happy that you kept track of this information, because it's going to help you forecast and plan much better for the following year. Okay, so I have a bunch more in here. I think I have farm stand sheet. So this is a sheet that we printed out and listed all the crops, the units, how much we were selling it for, where we were capturing it, how much we planned to bring, how much we actually brought, how much we took home at the end of the day, how much we actually sold. The final lot code, this is something, food safety training that we integrated into it. I'm not going to get into that, but we had that in there. So we had a few different markets. We sold the dining. We had a CSA sheet. I have watering sheets, irrigation schedules. So if someone asked about, I believe Mary asked me about how I map out our field. So this is an example where I took a screen capture of the student farm from overhead. We labeled everything with directions. So we had a northwest north field, a northwest field, northeast field, high tunnel 1, site 1, high tunnel 1, site 2. So I just saved this in preview on my Mac, and you can draw in all this stuff really easily. So this is a nice way to keep track of this. So when people need directions, when you need to say we're going to plant the arugula in northwest bed 1, they can look at this map and know where they need to go. Or for harvesting, you know that the arugula is in northwest bed 1, so you can just direct someone to where that is and they can see it on a sheet like this. So I can send you guys this template too. It has a number of different sheets, and again, you can just adapt these to however you want to adapt it for your particular setup. But it's just nice to have a physical sheet of something to write this information down, and then later you can capture it in your spreadsheet for planning purposes later. So in reference, the last sheet I'll show you before we take some questions and just go ahead and end the presentation, I was talking a little bit about the farm stand record sheet. So let's say, for instance, you guys are selling at a market, or you're donating to a food kitchen or a pantry, and you want to track the amount that you're bringing, the amount that you're getting rid of or selling, and all that information. So it's really good to track that information every single week on a template like this, because if you track it physically, then at the end of the year, what you can do is create another sheet like this. So I've pulled up another spreadsheet here that you should be able to see. And this spreadsheet, it should have a crop column on the left, units, prices, first week brought, number of weeks brought, percent sold, harvested, how much we brought home, how much we sold, gross sales, lost sales, sold per week, sales per week. So if you keep track of that data every single week, you can I spend a little bit of time making a spreadsheet. You could either do this weekly, you could do this on a running total weekly, or you could do it at the end of the year. And what you're looking at here is a full year's worth of data of sales records for the farm stand for the student farm. Okay, and the reason why this is super useful, because what I've done here, this is an organized, sorted spreadsheet based on column K, which is gross sales. So here you can see what you had the highest gross sales in. And in our case, we did really well with tomatoes, regular and heirlooms, peppers, eggplant, so you can go on and down the list. And this is a really useful tool for at the end of the year when you have your records in place. You can look and say, oh man, we did really good with tomatoes and peppers, but we didn't do very good with dill or daikon radishes or turnips or leeks or sweet corn. So this is a really simple way that you could evaluate how well your crops did at the end of the year, whether you're selling them or you're donating them or something, just a keeping track of all that information and then sorting it and analyzing it at the end of the year. So you can kind of evaluate and see what did well and what you might want to either plan more for the following season or plan less of because it didn't sell as well. Okay, so I can send you guys this sheet as well. This is just a real simple spreadsheet that I put together that was an aggregation of data from a record sheet like this. Okay, So again, you could digitize this if you want. Like you could have this on a Google Sheet or just a living document in your iPad. And again, some people might do that and that might work really well. But for me, I just found it easier to print out record keeping sheets and have yourself or your workers write the information down, and then at the end of the year just input that information into a spreadsheet like this that you could sort easily and analyze all this different data. Okay, so so that's about all that I have. It's about 6. I kind of wanted to end right now anyway. So if there's any questions, let's have a dialogue about it right now for a few minutes. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and send this to everyone that's on the call. And you can feel free to email me. You'll have my email address if you have any further questions about it. So does anyone have any questions while I'm still on the line?